This is Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
On the show, you'll hear real conversations about what matters most to the people behind the scenes who are shaping Australian construction.
From lawyers and contract administrators to engineers, commercial managers, consultants, and all the other experts forging the future of Australian infrastructure today. I'm Mawona Matanda.
I'm BJ Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. Today we're speaking with Elena Stojcevski and Veno Panicker, both partners at Hamilton Locke Lawyers. Elena specialises in complex construction and commercial disputes and has significant experience in arbitration, litigation, expert determinations and dispute resolution boards, as well as expertise in delay and programming disputes. Veno has over 20 years' experience advising clients from tenders through to project delivery, specialising in complex transactions as well as dispute resolution. Today we'll be diving into how AI has the potential to solve the productivity problem on mega projects such as the Brisbane 2032 Olympics, as well as discussing some of the legal complexities associated with AI use. Let's jump in. Elena, Veno, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You both jointly presented a paper at the 2025 SoCLA National Conference called Bricks, Bytes and Legal Rights, How AI Can Shape the 2032 Brisbane Olympics. Elena, I'll start with you. What led to you deciding to submit a paper?
Well, first of all, the SoCLA conference is always a highlight of the legal calendar. I do find that most of the presentations are really insightful and thought-provoking, so I wanted to be a part of that. Specifically in relation to Brisbane, I found that it was kind of a convergence of two huge trends, one technical and one geopolitical. On one hand, we're seeing the rapid rise of AI, particularly generative AI, which is starting to reshape every knowledge-based industry, from law to architecture, planning and design. On the other hand, we have the Brisbane 2032 Olympics, which really is a once-in-a-generation Olympic Games, and this will require a huge amount of coordinated infrastructure delivery. As we all probably know, the Games aren't just a sporting event. They're going to be a $7 billion investment that will reshape the transport systems, build housing, transform tourism precincts, and impact communities across Queensland for decades. In the past, there's been a trend of Olympic Games going over budget, and I saw an opportunity there. I wanted to see, could AI actually help us break that cycle? Could it support faster decision-making, reduce late-stage design changes, streamline contracts, change project governance, and help us deliver perhaps better outcomes at a better cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So your paper talks about the fact that despite the fact that there's been a rapid uptake of AI in other industries, the construction industry has been quite slow to utilise AI. Why do you think that is?
It's a really good question and it's difficult to know, but I think there are a couple of key themes that come across. The first is that the construction industry has traditionally been really cautious when it comes to new technologies, and you can understand why. When you're building a hospital or a stadium or a bridge or any large infrastructure, you can't really take the risk in using unproven systems, not just for safety, but also in terms of cost. So if a software tool breaks down and produces bad data, it doesn't just affect the timeline, it also can affect legal liability and millions of dollars in rework. So that leads, I think, to the industry being quite conservative, and they like to use what's well known. Why fix it if it's not broken?
I think that's exacerbated by the dispersed nature of the industry as well. So at the top end of town, your larger contractors, your government bodies have the resources to adopt new technology better than your mum and dad companies, your mid-tier and your smaller contractors that are struggling to make margins that are quite small.
Yeah, so it's these two issues of perhaps a lack of trust in the AI, in its ability to actually deliver the outcomes, and also the cost issue for particularly the smaller projects, residential projects and that end of town.
Well, it takes a lot to set these systems up, it needs a wholesale implementation, and that costs a lot of money. So to get that investment is difficult when there's already so much that the industry has to spend its money on.
Absolutely. But then there's also been slow uptake from the top end of town as well, hasn't there, in terms of use of AI? So why do you think that is? What are some of the barriers that might be there aside from potentially the cost issue for use of AI on these mega projects?
I think there's been a lot of scaremongering, particularly by the unions. The unions recently have proposed things like having a right of veto to use of AI on projects. That's regressive. It doesn't save jobs in the short or long term. But that fear-mongering in the face of a skill shortage, in the face of having to work with unions, has been one problem. But also, with margins as tight as they are on particularly larger projects, there isn't actually money for innovation.
And there's no incentive at the moment either. So top tier contractors or contracts at the top of the market aren't incentivized to use AI. You know, where do you allocate your money? Do you put it in tech, or do you put it in building, finding efficiencies in other ways in terms of your workforce? There are so many different factors that are influencing decisions that are being made, including red tape and issues around privacy and concerns there that haven't yet been able to be worked through in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned before, it's this also philosophy or culture of if it's not broken, don't fix it. But yet, on the other hand, the industry is kind of broken at the moment. There's a lot of talk about the productivity problem facing the construction industry. Veno, what do you see as the key productivity issues that we're facing at the moment?
I think it starts with our procurement models. I think that, and I say it to Engineers Australia every year, and it's always well received by the engineers, but more design on a competitively priced basis for public procurement in particular will actually incentivise the use of new technology, will actually genuinely incentivise value engineering, and will lead to programs that are more certain with contingency for known unknowns properly planned. I feel like we're too, and it's driven by the electoral cycle in part, but there's too much of a focus on a certain price point at a time where design is embryonic or in a state of flux at best. Michael Wallow, who used to be at Leighton's, did his doctoral thesis on the fallacy that on big projects, there's certainty of what it looks like at the end when you start. And with the speed that AI is changing, even 6 months ago when I would play with ChatGPT or Copilot or Harvey, it would hallucinate cases, maybe 1 in 10. It's closer to 1 in 100 or less now, and that's in the space of maybe 6 months. You need a model that will allow you to adapt and adopt new technology, and that requires some flexibility, not a lump sum.
Yeah, absolutely. The technology is changing at such a rapid pace, and it's going to be difficult for people who don't get on board, I think, in the future, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. And that's compounded by our skill shortage. It's compounded by our inability to pivot to new technology. We saw a presentation recently where Seema White's CTO presented on automation of site induction, where what took 18 minutes now takes 2 minutes. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but if it's every person on site and there's 1,000 people on site across various sites every day, it actually adds up. And that's just automation, which is lower hanging fruit than things like AI. It's just process improvement. But even that took a lot of convincing to get standardized and automated, but that led to huge productivity savings. So that I think we need more incentives, particularly in public projects, where contractors are paid to innovate and to adopt new technologies.
And in the same vein, we need less red tape. So on these types of big major infrastructure projects like the Brisbane Olympics, if you want AI to be used and to assist contractors, there needs to be red tape to actually allow them to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what I'm hearing is it needs to be something that comes from the top down as being something to be used in these types of mega projects.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the risk is also otherwise you'll eventually have your haves and your have-nots, and even just having simple pass-through and an incentive to use it on a paid basis would be good, because if given the option, a company at the top end of town is far more likely to adopt new technology if they're paid for it. Whereas a mum and dad company, unless there's a clear pass through, simply don't have the resources. And everyone wins in that situation because AI wins on big data sets and more use. The more it's used, the better it becomes, the better the machine learns the processes or becomes more intuitive. So that the other thing that's an impediment to it is that we haven't had and Elle detailed this in her paper, but we haven't got a software that's the leader, and not having that universal tool is an impediment because it works on large data.
And I think therein lies part of the problem, because at the moment there is no incentive for contractors to share data. So it might be the case that everyone's working on their own AI tools in the background to try to get a competitive advantage, which you can understand. But without the sharing of data, then the systems don't get better, and we don't know how they can be most effectively used within the industry.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is a real issue in the industry where participants are not keen to share data, knowledge. Everything is quite secretive, isn't it? So that's a real roadblock to this issue. If we can turn now to the Brisbane Olympics, I think it's no secret, and your paper discusses the fact that in the past, Olympics have been subject to rather big blowouts in terms of budgets. Why do you think that is?
Well, they're obviously complex infrastructure projects that require a whole life cycle from design to procurement, and it's constantly changing and evolving, the design process. So I think that also makes it quite difficult. The tight timeframes also, if you don't have sufficient planning in the lead up to a design, like a big infrastructure project like the Games, it's quite easy for budgets to blow out. It's quite easy for procurement to have to be done rapidly. It's quite easy for contracts to be amended at the last minute to allow for design changes. That unfortunately all adds cost to a project. And in this day and age, we know that those budget blowouts happen really quickly. It doesn't take much for one small change, whilst it might seem insignificant, can actually be quite significant depending on the overall impact it has. So I think that's been traditionally part of the issue. But I think also there's been some times I feel the Games don't allow enough of a budget. So there's always a view that this huge infrastructure projects can be done within a certain price within the time frame, but it's actually not an accurate or realistic budget. And, then you're pushing up against that. You're already kind of starting behind the starting line quite significantly when you don't have realistic outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a history, hasn't there, of perhaps governments announcing budgets or announcing contract values for these types of big projects when it perhaps really hasn't been realistically tested in the market.
Yeah, that's right. And you don't know until you've gone through that procurement process. And I think one of the pleasing things with the Brisbane Games is they're looking at different procurement models, and that it won't necessarily all be one type of procurement model. And I think that's quite pleasing because they're already thinking about this flexibly. And as Veno said earlier, one of the things that the construction industry really needs to do from a top-down approach is really have some flexibility on how contracting models look, because what you start with might be different in where you end up. So having that flexibility at this time, I think, is really quite pleasing.
Yeah, definitely. And so your paper then goes into discussing some of the ways that AI might be utilised to assist with these types of issues in mega projects like the Olympics. Can you speak to some of the key ways that it might be able to assist?
Yeah, there's already so many different types of AI programs that exist that can already be helping and shaping what we do for the Brisbane Games. There are tools that are being used quite frequently now throughout North America and Europe that include things like risk modelling, that also include the ability to do various different design models very quickly without the need of, having your design consultants and architects starting from scratch with each iteration of a design. There are things like AI that allow you to input different data and weather settings so that you can find a design that is most energy efficient and will have long-term cost savings for the Queensland government. And then there's also really simple tools like cost estimation tools and estimating tools that allow the tracking of budgets in real time as the project progresses.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's already lots out there in the marketplace that are available. But I think one of the issues that we spoke of before is that there's not a real leader in terms of the available AI products for people to really get on board and trust. Is that what you think is one of the main issues why these sorts of products aren't being used to date?
I think so. I think the Australian industry is still waiting to see how it plays out elsewhere. You know, we've had some tech here for a long time, like the BIM modelling, and even today that's not used across the entirety of the industry. And that's a tech tool that's been around now for over 15 years. So there is, I think, still quite a bit of mistrust. I do believe that separate contracting companies are building their own tech, and that takes time. And as we spoke about earlier, that I think is in part due to wanting to maintain a commercial advantage and not having to share data or take a risk in inputting information in an AI that they're not comfortable using because they don't know what the outcome will be. Whereas if they're building and producing their own AI system, then there's a bit more security in that, or at least there's a sense there's a bit more security in that. And that's going to take more time than if you're using a system that's already there. I think the other issue, though, is there's a lack of knowledge. There's so much out there, and the industry is just not across all of the information. And how can it be in circumstances where contractors are really busy? They've got a billion things to do. You need almost a dedicated team looking at assessing, testing these systems before they're used, and that takes time and it costs money. So there are a few reasons I think that some of these systems aren't yet being implemented.
Yeah, it becomes overwhelming, doesn't it, and gets put in the too hard basket when there's just so much out there for you to dive into to gain that knowledge that you need in order to be confident using these kind of products. You mentioned before BIM. For those people who maybe haven't heard that terminology before, it stands for Building Information Modelling. Can you just briefly talk a little bit more about what BIM is?
So really, it's just a 3D model. It's a digital ecosystem that embeds all the data from scheduling, logistics, materials, compliance, to even lifestyle costs into the building model. And unlike your traditional CAD system, it works across all of those disciplines at the same time. So what it means is that in practice, architects, structural engineers, construction managers, legal teams, etc., can all use the same live model, and everyone's working essentially off a single source of truth.
And so the idea being that this helps with productivity or efficiencies because all the information is stored in the one area and you're all working in real time.
That's right. So there can be no version confusion. There can't be, one discipline working off version 3 and the other discipline working off version 5. Everyone's working off the same version and there's no miscommunication. The good thing is that it's not static. It's constantly moving. And so it means that, as you were saying, everyone's working together in real time and communicating in real time to take away version control issues and miscommunication issues.
Yeah, so you mentioned that this has been around for a while and the uptake on use of this has been somewhat slow. Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. I think, again, part of it is cost. I think part of it potentially is mistrust in the system. I also think that part of it is just not having the time to properly be trained up and learn how BIM works and to use the system.
Yeah, so these recurring themes of lack of trust and cost issues potentially preventing us from utilising these types of technologies.
You can also see, to Vino's point earlier, how tier 1 contractors, tier 2 contractors might have the resources to be able to use BIM, whereas smaller contractors may not have the resources available to invest in BIM and use it on its projects because the projects might not be of a scale where BIM's going to be useful.
BIM also means a lot more transparency. So historically, if you take a rail project in New South Wales, you'd have, before they all got consolidated, about 5 different bodies. You'd have to tick a whole bunch of different bodies and you'd have to manually get drawings approved from each of them, and it'd all be a risk on the contractor. And what that meant is that the different rail bodies had months to do their design reviews. BIM brings it right up to the forefront, and it's obvious who's the delay. And as a state body or a federal body, they don't want it. They're scared because they get exposed. And it matters because it gives you real-time accountability for design management. And I think one of the reasons, primarily acting on the contractor side on infrastructure projects, is that it requires that transparency and accountability, and that can be an anathema to a lot of state government bodies at times.
So making things clearer is potentially not something that we want to.
Having real-time design and where it's at and who's the roadblock or delay, that's not necessarily in everyone's interest. Whereas contractually, you can make that all the contractor's risk when you can see it in real time. Irrespective of how that risk is allocated, it's obvious who's the roadblock.
And what about AI in the procurement process itself? Obviously, people would be aware that AI has been put forward as something that can help with the contract drafting or the contract review process. What are your thoughts about AI involvement there?
It depends on the size of the entities that are involved. So the automation of your downstream contracts has become pretty commonplace. At Hamilton Locke, we've got a steering committee that's dealing with how we automate and how we use AI. We've got an in-house Harvey tool, we've got an in-house Copilot tool, and we've got an in-house JBot, each of which tries to look at how we can use automation, how we can use smart contracts. At the bottom end of the spectrum, you get into issues with unfair contracts legislation where you have automation and process-driven agreements, a bit like the really long Facebook agreement that no one reads or the Apple agreement that no one reads. At the bottom end of the food chain, for subcontractors that fall within the threshold, they need to understand, they need the right to negotiate. But I think that we'll get to a point fairly soon where if the risk profile of a contractor is known, then it'll only be where it's outside that risk profile that you need to monitor it.
There are also practical ways that AI can help with the procurement process that aren't based on just the specific kind of contract and the risk allocation there. So there's already AI that exists that can assist in supply chain risk analytics, and you can actually continuously monitor and review how your suppliers are performing, track your cost fluctuations, look at disruptions due to weather or any other reason. And if a supplier is falling behind, you've got the system there to alert you in real time, so you can go find another procurement provider or look at ways of managing the risks that might exist. It actually allows you to look into the future in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, turning to some of the legal complexities associated with the use of AI, I think we spoke about before on the lack of trust piece that people have with respect to AI is this uncertainty around some of the legal complexities associated with use of AI. What are some of those issues that need to be considered?
I think IP rights and privacy rights are huge issues in Australia, where we have a robust system for both and the protection of both. And the conundrum is competitors like China don't have those. So they have bigger data sets without those impediments. And what that means is their propensity to develop those AI tools is streets ahead in circumstances where they already have lower costs for labour and procurement generally. And it becomes a balancing act as to how we can manage particularly the privacy concerns which are valid and how we can best preserve IP, which are both constraints on the machine learning and inputs.
Yeah, I think another risk that was touched on earlier is the AI hallucinations and misinformation that still exists and the risks that come around that may result as a consequence of that. And that can, I think, lead to reputational and financial risks as well, not just legal. And so that, I think, is something that we need to be cognizant of as well, in making sure that we're checking data outputs in a way that makes sense in terms of what the AI is producing.
And what role do you think it might play potentially in reducing disputes in these complex projects?
Well, you're going to have AI that can, I think, really rapidly detect issues that could exist in contract drafting and ambiguities or design inconsistencies in a really quick, efficient way that would otherwise, may take some time to manifest. You might not realise that these inconsistencies exist until you're actually in constructing whatever it is that you're constructing. And so I think that's going to be quite useful. I think that there's also going to be the other practical application of doing audits and audit trails in a way that's much more efficient and quicker than you can do in real time using, other consultants, accountants, lawyers, etc. And then when it comes to actually looking something like your enforcement or arbitration and things like that, AI can review documents and data sets really quickly. So there's going to be efficiencies there in terms of discovery and helping to hopefully reduce the data set so that it is a key data set that the parties are all working off, rather than, spending months, years often reviewing data and trying to determine what's relevant and what's not. You're going to get, I think, more and more experts in particular using AI to assist with their data set production and review of data for expert reports. And we've already seen across Australia the Supreme Court's looking at this really closely and putting in the guidelines that are now to be followed, understanding that this is going to happen, it's going to be part of what we do, and so making sure that it is being used in a way that is fair within the legal system.
So we talked before about the fact that the construction industry is quite cautious when it comes to AI, but obviously lawyers are famously cautious and conservative. So what approach do you think that lawyers should be taking to the use of AI in their work?
I think we've got to accept and embrace it. It's here. It can't be avoided. You can't put your head in the sand, and it's coming quicker than people expect. So that we've tried to put in processes at the firm where you look at the use of AI in almost every aspect of what you're doing. If it's a first draft of an advice, well, can we get some research off AI? Now, it's not relied on by itself. You still need that human element to supervise and double check. But if you're not looking to incorporate it into every aspect of your practice, you're going to be left behind.
Absolutely. And so finally now, if I can get you both to take out your crystal ball and sort of make a prediction for how you think AI is going to be used in the construction industry in the future. Is it going to take over all of our jobs? Is it going to be Skynet? What are your predictions?
I don't think we'll get to Skynet anytime soon, although who knows, Veno might have a different view to me. I think the reality is that AI will be used. There's absolutely going to be a place for AI to be used side by side with physical work. It's not going to replace the work we do, but it will help with efficiency and streamlining a lot of disciplines, particularly in that design stage before you get to construction, although there will be a place for AI eventually, I think, in construction as well, in the physical construction.
Yeah, I think we're way off from Skynet, but when you see things like Neuralink, maybe not so far away. But for the legal industry, I think we'll have a lot less of a leverage model in terms of the partner and number of lawyers, particularly at the junior end. We're already seeing firms reduce their intake because of the adoption of AI. Even going back 15, 20 years ago, discovery used to be bread and butter for your baby lawyers to cut their teeth. That's all automated. It's done by data companies as opposed to lawyers. And you get the documents on a database, which is externally hosted, all deduped with email, host and attachment in chronologies by issue or keyword or fuzzy search or Boolean search. In the same way, I think a lot of that early stage work in terms of drafting and consistent use of capitalized terms, and that grunt work will be lost to AI, and that's just something we have to accept. I think the future will be maybe one partner and a couple of lawyers, or a couple of mid-level lawyers and maybe one junior, as opposed to having that pyramid structure where you have a multitude of juniors. I think the same will be the case in engineering, where I think they'll embrace the technology. I think the labour force will be the last bastion of non-adoption because of things like the unions being regressive, but I think it'll be to our detriment. I think that robotics and automation are here, and we've just got to accept that. It might mean a 4-day work week. It might be better for us. It might mean a better lifestyle. It won't necessarily be Skynet.
It may be a utopia. We may be all happy and healthy and solved all the world's problems. So we shall see. Thank you so much both for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
That was Elena Stojcevski and Veno Panicker, both partners at Hamilton Locke Lawyers. To hear more great thinkers in construction law, join us at the 2026 SoCLA National Conference, which will be held in Sydney from the 6th to the 8th of May. Thanks for listening to Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
The Society of Construction Law Australia is a national organisation of members at all stages of their professional career with a shared interest in construction law.
For more info about the Society of Construction Law Australia, head to the website scl.org.au. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Sound Cartel.
To make sure you don't miss an episode of Building Tomorrow, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app.
And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Moana Matanda.
I'm Bijay Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. And we'll see you in the next episode of Building Tomorrow.